Hello and welcome to another episode of the Modern Maker Workroom. Have you wondered how to make a nice 17th century style sleeve with a good cuff interfacing and one that turns back so that you can wear a beautiful linen cuff on top? Well, look no further. This video shows you how to assemble them from start to finish and set them into the armhole of the doublet. Now, this is the finale episode of what has been a long year of making videos from various parts of this outfit. We started way back in 2019. We've been interrupted by a global pandemic, but here we are, finally at the end, ready to look at the entire outfit from top to bottom, complete. So I hope you'll enjoy this episode and come with me on this journey. Thank you so much for your patience. It's been really great teaching you, and I look forward to showing you more interesting things next season. Take care and happy stitching. To begin the sleeves, we will lay them right sides together one at a time so that I can start assembling them. I'll begin with a basting stitch that goes all the way up the foreseam. We always sew the foreseam first, especially in a sleeve like this, which has a cuff. Once the basting is complete, then I'll take my heavy silk thread or whatever heavy sewing thread you're using, and I will make a back stitch right along the seam allowance line. In this case, I'm using a nice narrow seam allowance because I want to keep a little bit of room in the sleeve, which is already quite slim to begin with. When the back stitching is complete, I will remove my basting and then I will give the sleeve just a one quick press, and what that does is kind of smashes the threads down and locks them in place before pressing the seam allowance open. Once the sleeve is on the sleeve board, then I can use the iron and press the allowance open. Before I sew the hind seam, I need to actually cut the canvas for the wrist. Now, I usually do this after the foreseam is closed because that gives me the opportunity to place the canvas across the seam, and it also gives me something in that seam allowance that I can attach the canvas to. And you'll see momentarily how that works. After I have used a cross stitch to put this in place, then I will grab my sewing thread and I'm going to come up underneath the seam allowance and underneath the canvas, but I'm not going through to the outside. Now that I'm on the surface of the canvas, I will just take some small pick stitches through the canvas into the seam allowance, but I have my fingers underneath the work to make sure that I don't penetrate all the way through to the outside. There's no need to do that in this particular portion of the sleeve. Once that seam allowance is secured to the canvas, then I'll turn to the outside and I'll use very small, as nondescript as possible, prick stitches to catch the top of the canvas onto the wrist. Now, this particular style of cuff folds back, so I'm not so worried about having exposed stitches because when the cuff is folded back, it won't be exposed. Once that's done, then I will work my way around the perimeter with a long running stitch to secure the canvas in place around the exterior edge. Whenever I'm pressing an edge like this, which needs to be nice and crisp and very firm, I take my clapper and I will heat the seam up, or heat the edge up with the iron, and then press very hard with the clapper to give a nice crisp edge. And then the little allowance that sticks out from the corner, I will just fold back so that it does not expose itself on the outside. Then I will take my sewing thread and I will just use a whip stitch to secure the hem in place. Notice every step of the way, especially when I'm working on edges like this, I don't leave anything to chance. If I want it to stay secure, I stitch it down and then I press it. With all of this complete, I need to make the cuff shaped a little bit differently. Which brings me to this portion called forming the cuff. Now you'll see what I'm doing is I'm stretching the bottom edge and I'm heating it up with the iron. It's as though I'm trying to put more curve into the bottom, and I am. And essentially what I'm doing is trying to get a conical shape formed into the very bottom portion of the wrist. And you can see now after that forming, this curvature that happens is because I've created that conical shaping in the piece of fabric just by steaming the outer edge and stretching it a little bit. With that complete, I need to take a moment and prepare the lining so that I can stitch it in place. And just like the outer sleeve, with the lining, I need to sew the foreseam first. So I just begin by placing the edges together with an inner sleeve and an outer sleeve, and then notice that I'm using the little pin here to secure it, which will make it faster and easier for me to use the running stitch. It gives me something to pull against and helps to support the piece while I work. I'm going to jump ahead really quickly here because there's so much that has to happen. It just makes it easier for me to explain the stitch. You can pause if you need to continue to follow it along. Again, I will give the foreseam a press with the iron before pressing it open. And that again is just so that I can secure the stitching in place. It kind of crimps it into the material so that it is a little bit more strong. And then I will press one end of the foreseam and then I'll flip it around and press the second one. To place it into the cuff, I will line up the outer or the shell and the lining together, and then my next step is going to be to secure the foreseam of the lining to the seam allowance of the exterior. And this is a really crucial step, I think, in making a garment last a really long time because it keeps the lining in place. It doesn't allow it to shift and roll out the bottom. It definitely holds it where it needs to be, allowing the outer and inner layers of the shell and the lining to function like one piece of fabric. Once everything is pinned in place and aligned, then I will use a running stitch as very close to the stitching as I possibly can, and this will help secure that lining in place. Now that it's there, I am turning my attention back down to the cuff, and you'll see that everything's aligned. I'm going to clip in the same place that I clipped the exterior, and then I will fold the edges in, baste them in place, and begin to stitch. Now the stitch that I'll use for actually sewing this, right now I'm just basting it in place, but the stitch that I'll actually use for sewing is just a plain pick stitch, which you will see here in a contrasting color so that it's easy for you to see on camera. That does not necessarily mean that you must use a contrasting color. In fact, it's more likely that the color would be used that matches the lining. A plain linen would probably be best. With the pick stitch, it is treated very much like a back stitch that's spaced far apart. So even though the motion is similar to a back stitch, what you see is actually tiny little dots of stitches. I'm speeding this up so that I can get through here really quickly for you. I wish I could sew that quickly, but I can't. Once complete, I give it a nice press with the iron. And I don't show it on camera, but I will actually stretch it again to make sure that that forming is still in place. And then I just test it by turning this cuff back and having a look at the way it sits. And I like it and it's good, and now I can move on. We've stitched the four seams of the sleeve and the lining, and now we need to stitch the hind seam. But both our lining and our exterior are now attached at the foreseam, so this has to happen in two steps. The first is the exterior, and you'll see me here bringing the notches together, and I'm placing my pin. Now, I will pin this together at this point, but there's actually a stop notch a little further up on the sleeve, which is where the cuff opening actually goes. I haven't shown it yet, and eventually there will be a hook and eye at that point, but the hind seam has to get pinned all the way up and then it will get stitched. Typically, I will also baste this before I start my back stitching, but I was in kind of a hurry to get to the end of this project, so I just stuck some pins in and prayed that my threads wouldn't get caught on each other. So the back stitching, it takes a little bit of time because they're small and consistent stitches, but once the seam's complete, then it gets pressed open, and then the entire process is repeated with the lining. Right here you can see where that stop notch is, where I'm leaving it open all the way down to the wrist and then to the cuff that turns back, and that will just make it easier to get the hand in and out of the garment. Now I am on to repeating this exact same process with the hind seam of the lining. It's pinned the same way, it is stitched the same way, it is pressed the same way. There's no need to do anything different here. Now you can put these seam allowances together and baste them in place as well, the same way that you did the front, although I find that it is not strictly necessary. Usually just basting together the foreseam helps hold it secure, and you don't need to do the back. Once that's done, then I will return to my wrist opening and I will finish off the edges that I've just turned in to extend the cuff opening all the way up to my stop notch, and it will be back stitched and carefully secured, as well as secured with a bar tack at the top of the wrist opening. And this is because it's a tight fit on the body, and this little area can get stressed and can tear. So I usually put a bar tack right here just to keep it from losing strength over time. It's something that takes just a couple of seconds to do, and it helps the garment last a lifetime. Once all of that stitching is complete, then I just use the closed tip of my snips to pick the basting out from the wrist, and that way I can be done and I can move on. The next step is setting the sleeve into the armhole. Now at this point, you'll see me just put the sleeve into the armhole and start stitching. Presumably, you have made some kind of mock-up at some point along this journey, so you know that the pitch of your sleeve is correct. I generally don't just cavalierly throw this in and stitch it in place. I do actually check to make sure that it's secure. So I begin at the armpit notch, matching the one on the sleeve with the one that's on the body from when we cut it out way back at the beginning. And then this sleeve cap has a little bit of fullness in it, so I will pin from the bottom most of the way to the top, and then I'll go around the other side most of the way to the top, and then the remaining fullness I will pin carefully in place into small, even bits of fullness that then when I stitch, I will wrap them up in each small stitch so that there's even, small, perfect little gathers right across the top of the sleeve. And in this case, it's just a very small amount and kind of similar to some of the pieces that we see in the mid-17th century in terms of, gathering the tension and how much fullness is actually in the cap. Since this pattern comes out of a manual from 1630, I figured that it was important to treat it in the same way. Once all of the pinning is done, again, ordinarily I would baste this after putting the pins in to get the pins out of the way while I stitch, but I was in a hurry, so I left the pins in and just proceeded boldly ahead, hoping for the best. And I don't think that I got it caught too many times, and if I did, you're probably not going to see it on camera. But again, small, tight back stitches, and then as I reach the crown of the sleeve, you will see me very carefully start to wrap each little bit of fullness up basically into its own tiny little cartridge pleat that I then nail down with a couple of stitches as I go. See, I've got a bit of fullness in that stitch, and then I pull really tight, and then I take a second stitch right on top of it before moving on to the next one. And this way, I can control the fullness and keep them very perfectly spaced right next to each other without having to actually run a gathering thread. Since it's such a small little area of gathering, it didn't seem like it was worth my time. With the seams sewn, here I'm just going to show you very quickly the gathering at the cap of the sleeve. It looks very good. It's nice and balanced. With the sleeve in place, now I'm going to clip the body side of the seam allowance. I don't really need to worry about the sleeve. The sleeve side is fine, but in certain parts of the body, the curvature of the armhole is very tight, and since I need to fold the seam allowance back into the body and stitch it in place, I don't want any tension that might then make it uncomfortable to wear. So I clip the seam allowance to give some ease and allow it to lie down properly. Once I've done that, then I'm going to use a whip stitch and my heavy thread, and I'm just going to whip the seam allowance to the wool padding. And if you recall, earlier in this process, I trimmed out a large portion of the seam allowance, leaving approximately double the seam allowance width in the area. And that's so when this step happens, the seam allowance basically has a little recess to sit down into, and that prevents excess bulk at the armhole seam, making it both more comfortable to wear and preventing any kind of lump from appearing in the garment while it's being worn. When that's complete, I can clip my thread and move on to working with the lining. There we go, a nice, clean armhole seam. In this situation, I will follow my own rules and I will baste this in place rather than pin it. So I am just folding back the seam allowance on the lining and placing it right up against my back stitches, which, for all intents and purposes, those back stitches would probably be done in a matching thread to the lining or just a neutral, natural colored linen thread. Extant garments tend to show just plain linen thread used for main construction seams. But again, I'm using contrast stitching in many places so that it's easier for you to see. But you'll notice that I put the front lining in first around the armhole, and then I will lay the back lining on top of it, beginning at the back neckline, working my way forward, and then I will fold the back shoulder of the back lining into place on top of the front shoulder. And what all of this is doing is it is basically securing every edge of every piece of lining on its own. There is no area in here where the lining is simply sewn to the lining and is not also attached to the canvases inside the doublet. This, again, gives lots of support and structure. It makes the lining move as one with the exterior of the garment, preventing anything from wadding up or pulling or getting loosened because it's hanging loose inside. So in a modern context, we would call what we do modernly, we would call a bagged lining. And this is definitely not a bagged lining. This is a stitched lining. It's stitched to every seam all the way around, and it's very secure and it doesn't move when it's worn. So once all of the basting is in place, then again, I'm switching to my heavier thread, which you can see really clearly here. It's my heavy silk thread, and then I'm using a pick stitch to secure it. Now this pick stitch does not go all the way through the material. This pick stitch only goes into the seam allowance, and in the case of the neckline, it goes into the stay tape that's used inside the neckline. Once I reach the shoulder, I will turn and go across the shoulder, sewing through all of these layers right down into the canvassing and the tailoring that is inside the garment at the shoulder. And this gives it so much security and strength. When I reach the armhole edge, then I will turn again and continue to use pick stitches around the entire armhole, ending back where I started at the crown of the shoulder. These pick stitches, you must be careful not to go all the way through to the outside. You will run the risk of some pretty unsightly stitches showing right at the armhole if you do. So please be careful. Make sure that you get everything nice and regular, especially if you're using a contrast color like I am. You want these stitches to be spot on in distance from each other because it's very much an eyesore if you get it wrong, which is, again, a great reason to use a matching color thread. When all is said and done, this armhole will be very firmly stitched in place. The entire thing is almost self-supporting. I took a couple of great photos of this piece just lying on the cutting table while I was working, and it stands up on its own. It has so much inner structure and so much life. It really stands up well on its own. I think it would be very comfortable to wear because of that. It's not relying on the body to give it its structure. It carries its own structure. Now the armhole is done. I have a moment to begin to remove bastings. And that is probably my favorite part of the entire process, is taking out all of the bastings and letting the garment begin to live with its own structure, begin to support itself. The bastings aren't needed anymore because everything has been stitched, everything has been secured, and it is ready to be complete. I won't show you all of the removal because it's just picking out basting stitches. I use the tips of my snips I'm very carefully holding them closed, but my snips have a blunt tip on them, which makes it really easy to slip underneath and pick my stitches out. All the basting is out. This garment has one small step remaining, and then it is done. All I have left to do is to place a hook and eye at the wrist so that when it goes on, this can be easily closed and it can be easily worn. A hook and eye is a very common kind of closure in the time period. When I first started doing historical dress, I was actually really surprised when I found out that the typical style of hook and eye was actually correct for the time period. For some reason, I just thought that everything would be done with lacing, but that's when I was young and less educated, and I just did not understand how old hooks and eyes were, and they were a huge part of the system of closing garments in the time period. So I'll stitch the eye on the outer side, and then I'll stitch the hook on the inner side. And this is what I'm doing right now, which you can barely see because the hook is so tiny. But I am actually stitching the head of the hook down onto the fabric as well. And this is something that a lot of beginning sewers don't know that you should do, is when you stitch the hook in place, you also need to put stitches through the very tip of the hook so that it holds the head of the hook in place and it doesn't let it swing around. Otherwise, it'll still end up gapping even though it's supposed to be closing it. It's all complete. And now let's give you a demonstration on the mannequin to show all the layers of this wonderful piece.